Why South Sudan? An Every Village podcast where we answer questions about the world's youngest nation. The question of the day is, was South Sudan ever colonized? Hey everyone, this is Tiana Johnston, the host of this podcast called Why South Sudan? All right, so today is going to be a goodie because of many reasons, but mostly because today is episode 50 and the crowd goes wild. You can go wild.
Oh, well, you haven't introduced me yet.
You're the crowd.
Oh, yay! Well, I thought it would be weird because I hadn't been introduced yet.
As you can tell, we do not rehearse these before we start them. So the crowd is Andrew Brown.
That's a good nickname, the crowd.
The crowd, yes. So today is episode 50. I'm so proud of us. We've gotten this far. We're literally going to make a year very, very soon, which is very exciting. I know. So exciting. So today I thought, what better? One, I mean, we went through a lot of history over the last 49 episodes, and we went in great detail about South Sudan and every village, but I thought it would be really good because really the best way to go forward is to go back. Ooh, that's a good one.
If you're on the globe and you go backward far enough, then you will end up ahead of where you were when you started.
Oh, that's true. All right, so today's question is, was South Sudan ever colonized? I'm excited to dive into it to kind of learn a little bit more. You are a history buff. I don't know how you have it in your brain, but you do.
I will admit I might have done a little bit of cramming for this one.
No, that's good.
But yeah.
That's good. It's more than probably what any of your listeners know, including myself. So we're excited to learn. So please share.
Well, great. Yeah. Well, we did, I think in some of our first episodes, we talked about the history of South Sudan, but we focused primarily on their, lead up to independence from Sudan, and which was July 9th, 2011. We're going to go back much farther than that. And I think I did probably reference some of those early years of colonization before that. We know the British Empire, of course, was just a mass empire that spanned the globe in many respects. And colonization was not just for the British in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but really a lot of the European nations were colonizing. And when you look at the entire continent of Africa, there's really only one nation that claims that they were never colonized in all of Africa, and that was Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. Well, I should have asked you if you knew that.
Oh.
So Ethiopia did have some Italian influence, but the Italians probably gave up and went back to their pasta before they ever conquered Ethiopia. So they're lovers, not fighters, I guess. But so Ethiopia holds that distinction. But all the other nations in Africa were ruled at some point by a European colony. So the British, the Italians, the Spanish. The Spanish only had a tiny little portion. The French, of course, Belgians, and Portuguese were kind of the predominant colonists. And so South Sudan, or let me back up and just remind our listeners, South Sudan has only been around for 13 years, 2011. Prior to that, they were a region of Southern Sudan, which was part of Sudan. So now when you refer to South Sudan today, it is an independent nation distinct from Sudan. They're two different places. However, they were not always that way. And so Southern Sudan was a region as a part of Sudan. And so you could refer to the people that we work among as the Sudanese. Well, now they're the South Sudanese. So when it was all Sudan, it was that if you look at a globe, it's right just south of Egypt. And the British were in Egypt and kind of semi-conquered Egypt as well. The British kind of had a collaborative approach in Egypt, a little bit unique from some of their other colonies, but still, eventually in the late 1800s, the British wanted to go down into Sudan, and the Egyptians were in control of Sudan at that time. And so they eventually formed what's called the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium, which is basically a fancy term for the partnership between England or the British and the Egyptians' rule in Sudan. But that was kind of in name, but in practice, really the British were much more dominant in that ruling of Sudan, the region of Sudan. And so that's why I referred to it as a former British colony. It was technically Anglo-Egyptian colony. And so, when you look at the entire region that was once called Sudan together, it was the largest country in Africa. So it's a very large land mass. But about 2/3 of that grouping was what is now Sudan, the northern region, which is very arid. The Sahara Desert goes right through it. Topographically, it's just quite a bit different from the southern region. And southern Sudan, which now is South Sudan, is much more fertile, green, and just a little bit different topography. Well, those were all merged into one nation, and so the British kind of came down, and Khartoum is the capital of Sudan, and the British were certainly there controlling Khartoum. And then, they appointed different, military generals. One famous man named General Gordon, Charles Gordon, was kind of appointed to go down the Nile River into South Sudan, southern Sudan, and set up little outposts along the river. Keeping in mind, the biggest reason why the British were interested in the region of Sudan was because of the Nile River. So, access to the Nile is huge for trade and for military power anytime you have a big river. So we step back and look. South Sudan today is split right down the middle by the Nile River, the White Nile specifically. And the source of the Nile, is a little bit debated, but it starts in Uganda. Some would say Rwanda, but mostly Uganda, goes north. And of course, it's a river that flows from south to north, which is a little bit unique. And it flows up to the Mediterranean Sea. And so, that trade route is huge. And so they were trying to, control that. Well, when the Nile River enters South Sudan, then it splits off, maybe maybe 100 miles into the country, it splits off into the Sud, which is the wetlands. And it's the largest wetlands in Africa and one of the largest wetlands in the world. Spans hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of this basically uninhabitable, flotilla of vegetation. Basically, it's just floating pods of vegetation. And, we fly over it sometimes when we're going into South Sudan, and you can just see it just spans. And it's, every once in a while you might find a very remote settlement. It's amazing to me how people live out in the middle of those sections that are dry. But for the most part, it's just completely marshy wetlands. And so that delta goes out through South Sudan, and then it kind of reforms back into the White Nile, going up north into Sudan and then into Egypt. And so the British really cared a whole lot about that. And so that's primarily why they sent General Gordon down to set up these outposts, so that they could basically provide taxation and trade control down the river. The other thing is the British set up what's called the Southern Policy, which basically they handled the South Sudan region completely independent from the Northern Sudan region, because they recognized that there was just huge differences in race, in religion, in topography and accessibility. And so the British did a lot of investment in the development of Northern Sudan. Khartoum today is a modernized city, and of course they're in the middle of a war right now, a civil war, which is tragic. So they're kind of going backwards themselves, but they experienced a lot of development. I mean, there's roads and electricity and beautiful buildings and everything that you think of in a modern city. And a lot of Sudan has more, has paved roads and some more development. And but South Sudan never got that. The Southern Policy that the British enacted, basically they prevented all trade from coming into the southern region, and they just handled it completely differently. And South Sudan today, never experienced any development. There were never roads built, never any buildings built by the British, other than just simple, stone buildings that they for their outposts. And you still see some of those stone buildings in places like Tonge where we work. There's probably 15 or 20 around the town, stone buildings that are still left standing from the British rule, but they're just simple little buildings. They're like military barracks basically, and that's what you see. You see a few places in Mavolo. There's an old high court from the British that's just got the columns left, brick columns. So you see some vestiges of that British rule, but it was minimal. and they never really controlled it a lot. So all that to say, that went into the 1900s, and then in 1953, between the Egyptians and the British, they really moved towards creating Southern Sudan as an autonomous region, with then I'm sorry, I shouldn't say Southern Sudan. At that time, 1953, it was they really created all of Sudan as as an autonomous region from the British rule, and with a vote for secession in 1956, and that's what happened. January 1st, 1956, Sudan became independent from British rule completely and Egyptian rule, and formed the nation of Sudan. And we've talked about this before, but because colonization merged these, don't even want to say two people groups, because South Sudan itself has lots of people groups, but I'll call it at a larger level. You've got kind of the northern African, lighter-skinned Muslim people group from Sudan, North Sudan, and then you've got the black-skinned animistic Africans in southern Sudan. Well, they were all combined. Well, that wasn't going over well. At the same time, is North Sudan is receiving all this development and infrastructure. South Sudan's not receiving any of that. So there's a disparity of wealth, and there's oppression that's happening, and so they actually broke into their own civil war before independence in 1955. The South Sudanese had kind of resisted British rule and also resisted the Sudanese rule, and there was basically a military or a militia of Southern Sudanese called the Anyanya that really kind of led that fighting in those days from 1955 to 1972, and then that's when they signed a peace agreement, the first peace agreement that lasted for 11 years. 1983, the Sudan People's Liberation Army was formed, and that was a part of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the SPLM, and that was formed in 1983. That's when a second civil war broke out, and the SPLM today has continued to, now it's just considered the party of the president is the SPLM, and so that's kind of the history of colonization in that region. And colonization, there's a lot of different opinions about colonization all over the world and its impact. There are certainly some good aspects of the impact of colonization. There was some development happening from the British rule in different parts of the world, but South Sudan didn't see any of that. And so what I would say is there might be a lot of mixed feelings or opinions about colonization in general, but on the good side of colonization, South Sudan didn't receive any of the good side. And then, of course, there's kind of the negative side of colonization and the impact of merging different people groups and forcing things together and creating some animosity and instability that was left over after nations gained their independence. A lot of nations experienced that. Well, that's exactly what happened in South Sudan without all the benefits of development. And so that's what led to, all these years of war, and all these years later in 2024, South Sudan looks pretty much identical to what it looked like in 1955. There obviously, yes, there's some buildings, and the capital city of Juba, I would say, is the one area you could go to and say, okay, this is a bit different. But even that's only been in the last probably 10 years. I mean, certainly it started really developing after I've been working in South Sudan. And so, but in the areas where we work as a ministry, they look pretty much identical to what they did 60, 70 years ago. Pretty amazing. And so that's kind of the history of colonization. And, it's a mixed history, but what we find is the South Sudanese are such proud people, and they're such a strong people. And, if you go back in time in history, every nation has experienced days of trouble, and and some are able to rise out of that and form years of peace and prosperity. And we really believe, on both the national development side of things and then on the spiritual development side of things, that's possible, and that's a huge thing. The last thing, going way, way, way back, I didn't even realize, just interesting, as I was just doing some quick reading before this episode, even the Emperor Nero actually tried sending people down into southern Sudan because of the Nile River and access. So the Roman Empire was also working, and it's all about the rivers, and wasn't really able to navigate past the Sud, that wetlands. It is a very difficult place to navigate. And so it was amazing to me. This was in the year 61 AD. So we're talking 2,000 years ago almost. And there were already people trying to control this region. And they weren't able to go through what we know as South Sudan today. They had to skip around by land, and they ended up down to Uganda, the source of the Nile. But they never made it through the Sud. And then it made me think about a few years ago, there's a really kind of fun documentary called Walking the Nile. And it's a British guy who will do different adventure treks, and he will walk by foot. He walked the entire length of the Nile, or was his goal. He set out. So he started in Rwanda, so which is a disputed source of the Nile, and works his way north to Uganda, and then walks all the way along the Nile River. And it take months and months to do it, and he'll stop along the way. It's not a race. He'll enjoy the people groups and other things. This is a fascinating show. But he started walking there. I don't remember exactly. I think it was in January 2016. I don't remember exactly. But he made it through Uganda up into South Sudan and the Nile. He made it to Juba, the capital city. And then that's right when fighting broke out, significant fighting in the capital city of Juba. And he had made it just north to a town called Bor. And he's filming himself, and it's at night, and you can hear RPGs going in the background and fighting, and he's frightened. And so he ends up calling, it's a show, so he has backup, and he calls, his support team, and he evacuates. And they ended up taking him back to Juba, and then take him out of the country, and then he flies north into Sudan and skips the Sud portion of the Nile River, and then walks the rest of the way from all the way through Sudan, through Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. And it was a great show, but it just reminded me that here we are, Emperor Nero in 61 AD tried to make this trek and never made it. They had to skip past South Sudan by land. And here in 2016, we've got a modern day documentary guy try to the exact same journey, but the opposite direction, and he never made it through South Sudan. He had to skip his way and fly up to Sudan. That's how hard we're talking about. It's a really, really difficult place to work and to be, and that leads to the challenges that we experience as a ministry. But I don't know, it's just pretty fascinating to me just to see, we talk about this all the time, but these topographical, geopolitical, historical challenges that we're talking about here have led South Sudan to be the least developed nation in the world, one of the most expensive places to work in the world, one of the least accessible and least reached places in the world. Not because it's hostile, the people are very welcoming and friendly. They're sponges. They're open. It's fertile soil, but because it's just not easy to get there, and so very few people have done it or tried, and so we have the privilege of doing things that if we weren't there, there wouldn't be anybody else doing what we're doing in that part of the world. So we love it.
Man, today was cool. That was awesome. I think I really enjoyed also because I can envision it. I can see South Sudan. I can see all of it, the Nile and everything. So it's so, so cool. It also reminded me of one of our supporters, Marsha Turner. So she was actually born in Nasser.
Well, she was born in Cairo.
Oh, in Cairo.
But when she was 2 or 3 months old, she moved down to Nasser. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Because her dad was a
missionary doctor.
Yeah, missionary doctor.
Yeah.
And so she showed us pictures of years ago, and it's so crazy. There's actually one, this is actually another supporter, but their dad was working in South Sudan doing, I don't know what exactly, but he's running along a road in these little tiny shorts.
Oh, yeah.
But it's just South Sudan looked exactly the same. Kids and people wearing, one piece of clothing and no shoes. And it's just so crazy to see that years ago how exactly the same it is,
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, I think Marsha has shared maybe 6 or 7 black and white photos that she has. And there's 2 main differences from those pictures to today. One is there were lions. So there's
Yes.
pictures of her dad. He was lion hunting with some of the people, and there's a dead lion there. There aren't lions there anymore in that part, just because of war and other factors. So that was different. And then they flew in on MAF planes, which is who we fly. All the way back in the 1950s, MAF was around flying. But the big difference is they had a float plane. So there's a picture of them landing on the Sobat River, which is a tributary of the Nile, which is where we've got a boat every village, and I've been on that river many, many times, and we've talked about how much easier it would be to access Nasser during the rainy season if we had a float plane, but we just don't. And so we do have to land on the dirt airstrip, but it's not always accessible because of the rains. Well, back then in the 1950s, MAF had a float plane, and so that was two differences. But otherwise, you're exactly right. It looked the exact same, and there's a picture of some little mud figurines that kids had formed back in the 1950s. Those are the exact same
They still
things
do
that
it.
kids still do it, and those little
They
mud
make little
figurines.
cows. They
Yeah,
make people.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the huts, looked the exact same, and it's pretty wild. Yeah.
It is so wild. And it also makes me really, really appreciate the work that we do, and that we do feel called specifically to the South Sudanese, that we are going to the farthest reached people, and we care for them, and we want to show up, and it's worth all of the money it takes to even be able to work there, but also even to get there and travel. We actually get to go on a trip in a few weeks, and I'm so excited.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And let me just share one more thing that's a little bit off topic, but honestly, it's really related. And I would just say is while obviously colonization doesn't exist in name anymore, the truth is there's definitely modern day colonization through economic colonization and through controlling nations through economic policy and foreign aid and other factors. And then even kind of slightly related to that, but I'll call it an offshoot of that, is in some ways you can have missionary colonialization as well. And we're really careful to not do that. But it's so easy for, I'll just overgeneralize and say, the rich white man, which is what South Sudanese think, to come in. And if you're a missionary, it doesn't matter whether you're not rich in the United States, you're rich over there, right? And it's easy for you to come in and make the decisions and drive things. You're the ones that are funding it and organize it and control it and build it in your own image. And I'm not saying that that's the intent behind most missionaries. It's not. But it's so easy to fall into that. And so it's just like, I genuinely believe, the British colonists, a lot of them had really good intentions. It wasn't negative. And there were some good impacts, like we talked about with development, but there was also a lot of negative impacts because it was ultimately outside control without considering local resources, local people, involving them in that design and leadership and implementation. And it just left this big schism and holes when the British left. Well, the same thing can happen with missionaries. Is you can go in and serve for years, with community development or with the spread of the gospel, with training and teaching or whatever it is, and then when you leave, it all falls apart. It's not sustainable because it wasn't built around raising up local leaders and empowering them and seeing them change in the Lord and grow. And so that's another thing that it's just something I think it's important to bring up when we talk about colonization, that it feels like that's a distant historical subject. But if we're not careful, we can fall into the same thing. And so we think about that a lot. We talk about it a lot. And that's why I love that our South Sudanese team is leading this work. And that is the very heartbeat of the strength of where we're headed in the future. So anyway, just wanted to bring that up as well.
No, I'm glad that you did. I actually was recently asked in reference to that, of just like how, especially me as a missionary, how did every village train us to kind of not have the white savior complex of we're, very paternalistic mindset. And I think it's so easy, again, because I think your heart, our heart, or quote unquote motives, are supposed to be like, I want to help these people. I want to, help them in any way that I can. And that's what the motive is. But underlying it can be really muddy, where it's like, well, no, my way is right and your way is wrong. And so being able to share how, even as me as a missionary, that we were taught to be a learner, to go and learn from these people. And we get to walk alongside them to live a life for Jesus. And that's like such a beautiful thing. And that's what God did while I was there. But even now, years later, how much every village has changed. And I'm so grateful for the place that we are at, that we want to empower, that we're always going to have more South Sudanese staff than we are Americans. And I love that so much. And I think that does set us apart from other ministries. And I do pray that we continue that.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember being there for your missionary training.
Yes, you were there. He was my boss. Well, you still are my boss, actually. Oh, well, this one was so good. I might say this is probably one of my favorites, but I say that often, so maybe I won't. But this was really good. Oh, man. I mean, even just to learn the whole purpose, or like wait, how do you say it? Colonization.
It's a tough one.
Yeah. But like even the British, that it was all having to do with like transporting goods and like all of that. But then emphasizing how hard it is. And again, I'm so grateful we worked there. So, so good. Gets me fired up. So good. So we invite you back to the next episode as we answer the question, what is your favorite part about traveling to South Sudan? Take care.